The morning my daughter tried to sell my future began with something very small. A cup of coffee. I remember standing in the kitchen of the house I had lived in for 43 years, watching steam curl slowly from the mug in my hands while early autumn sunlight stretched across the oak floors. The same floors my husband Daniel had installed himself one winter when Julia was only 9 years old and insisted on helping by handing him nails she dropped half the time. There are houses people live in. And then there are houses people become. This one held the entire shape of my life. Every birthday candle. Every slammed teenage door. Every quiet night after Daniel's cancer diagnosis when the two of us sat at the kitchen table pretending we still had decades ahead. And on that morning, I had no idea my daughter had already begun planning to take it away. My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 72 years old. For most of my life, I believed the hardest thing a woman could endure was losing her husband. I was wrong. Sometimes the hardest thing is discovering the child you raised no longer sees you as a person. Only an obstacle. Daniel used to say Julia had the sharpest mind in any room. He was right. Even as a child she had a kind of quiet calculation behind her bright smile. Not cruel, not manipulative, at least not then, but observant in a way that made adults underestimate her. She noticed everything. The year she was 10, she pointed out that Daniel always rubbed his chest after climbing the stairs. "Daddy's heart hurts," she said one evening while we washed dishes together. Daniel laughed it off. 2 years later he had his first cardiac episode. That was Julia, always seeing patterns before anyone else. After Daniel passed 12 years ago, Julia stepped into the role of caretaker so smoothly that I never questioned it. She handled paperwork, taxes, mortgage refinances, insurance policies. "Mom, let me take care of it," she would say gently whenever I tried to help. "Thank you in advance. And you, what would you do in this person's place?" I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you. With heartfelt greetings. Until next time. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. And I believed her. Because mothers are trained, from the moment their children are placed in their arms, to trust love even when evidence grows complicated. The first change was subtle. Julia started visiting less often. At first it made sense. She had a demanding career in corporate marketing in Chicago, 3 hours away from my small town outside Grand Rapids. Long hours, constant travel, meetings that seemed to stretch into midnight conference calls. But eventually the distance felt different. Not physical. Emotional. Conversations became shorter. Her tone more impatient. Whenever I asked about her life she would answer quickly, as if the question itself had already exhausted her. And then came the first comment that made something in my chest tighten. It happened during Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. Julia sat across from me at the dining table Daniel had built by hand. Her boyfriend, Mark, a quiet man who worked in real estate, sat beside her, politely complimenting my cranberry sauce. Julia glanced around the room. "You know," she said casually, "this house is way too big for you now." I laughed lightly. Big houses get quieter with time. "That's exactly my point," she replied. Mark shifted uncomfortably. I ignored the comment then. But later that night, after they had gone to bed in the guest room, I stood alone in the hallway and looked at the walls lined with photographs. Julia's kindergarten picture with crooked pigtails. Her high school graduation. Daniel holding her the day she got accepted to Northwestern. This house had grown around her like a living thing. The idea of leaving it felt like cutting out a piece of my own memory. 6 months later, Julia brought up the topic again. This time she was more direct. "Mom, have you ever considered assisted living?" The word landed between us like something fragile and dangerous. "I'm perfectly healthy," I replied gently. "I know," she said quickly. "But planning ahead is smart." Her voice had a rehearsed quality. Like someone delivering lines they had practiced alone. I brushed it aside. But that night I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling Daniel had painted sky blue when Julia was a baby. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Not fear. Something closer to unease. The moment everything changed came 2 years later. On a quiet Thursday afternoon. I had been grocery shopping and returned earlier than expected. The house felt strangely alive when I stepped inside. Voices echoed faintly from the living room. Julia's voice. And another. "Mark." I set the grocery bags down quietly. They hadn't noticed me. The hallway carried sound clearly, every word drifting toward me like pieces of a conversation not meant to be heard. Julia spoke first. "If we list it next spring, we could easily get 600,000. Mark hesitated. "What about your mom?" A pause. Then Julia sighed. "She won't fight it. She doesn't even understand how the finances work." Something inside my chest tightened painfully. Mark lowered his voice. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Julia replied. "She trusts me completely." I stood there longer than I care to admit. Long enough for silence to fill the room again. Long enough for a realization to settle quietly over me. My daughter was planning a future where I had already been removed. And the worst part was not the house. It was the certainty in her voice. The absolute confidence that I would never question her. Never resist. Never even understand. That evening, after Julia and Mark left for their hotel in town, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened Daniel's old desk in the study. He had always been the organized one. Every document labeled. Every folder dated. Inside the bottom drawer sat a thick envelope I had noticed many times but never opened. Across the front, Daniel's handwriting read, "Margaret, for when you need to know." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside were documents I didn't recognize. Investment accounts. Property filings. Trust agreements. And a letter. Daniel's handwriting looked exactly the way I remembered it, steady, deliberate, slightly slanted to the right. I sat down before reading. Something in my heart already knew this envelope contained more than paperwork. "Margaret," the letter began. "If you're reading this, something has happened that made you question the people around you." I felt the room grow very still. Daniel continued. "You have the kindest heart I've ever known. But kindness can sometimes make people vulnerable." I swallowed slowly. "If anyone ever tries to make you believe you have no control over your life, I want you to remember something." My eyes moved to the final paragraph. "You are far more protected than you realize." I spent the next 2 hours reading every document in that envelope. By the time I finished, the world I thought I understood had quietly shifted beneath my feet. Daniel had spent the final years of his life preparing for possibilities I had never considered. Possibilities involving our daughter. And the truth he left behind would change everything. I sat in Daniel's study long after the daylight had faded from the windows. The lamp on his desk cast a warm circle of light across the document spread in front of me, and for the first time since his death 12 years earlier, I felt as if he were still speaking to me. Not through memory. Through preparation. Daniel had always been a cautious man. Not suspicious, not paranoid, but practical in a way that sometimes felt almost prophetic. When Julia was growing up, he used to joke that his job in life was to build safety nets no one would ever need. I had assumed he meant insurance policies, college funds, retirement accounts. What I was now holding in my hands was something very different. Daniel had quietly restructured nearly every major asset we owned during the last 3 years of his illness. Not to hide them, but to protect them. And strangely enough, the person he seemed most concerned about protecting them from was someone we both loved. Julia. The first document explained the structure clearly. The house was legally in my name alone. But not the way Julia believed. Daniel had created a protective trust that transferred control of the property to me under conditions that prevented anyone, including family, from forcing a sale without my written authorization. The language was precise. Almost surgical. Even if someone obtained power of attorney, the trust could not be dissolved without approval from a second party. The attorney Daniel had worked with. A woman named Eleanor Strauss. I had met Eleanor once, years ago, when Daniel insisted I accompany him to a routine estate review meeting. I remembered thinking it was unnecessary. At the time, Julia was 24, freshly graduated from Northwestern, already launching what looked like a brilliant career. The idea that we needed legal protections from our own daughter had seemed absurd. Yet here it was. Page after page of careful planning. And the house was only the beginning. The second folder made my breath catch. Daniel had quietly invested a portion of our retirement savings during the final years of his life. Conservatively, at first. Then more aggressively as certain opportunities emerged. I recognized the company names, technology firms, renewable energy startups, even a medical research group that had later made headlines. The value of those accounts had grown steadily over the past decade. Very steadily. By the time I reached the final statement, my hands had gone completely still. The total balance was just over $1.8 million. The accounts were held in a trust. A trust controlled by one person. Me. Julia had never known. And neither, until that moment, had I. I leaned back slowly in Daniel's chair. 1,000 emotions moved through me at once. Shock. Confusion. Gratitude. But underneath them all was something more complicated. A quiet, unsettling question. Why had Daniel felt the need to protect me this way? The answer waited in the final page of his letter. I read it 3 times before the meaning fully settled. Margaret, Daniel wrote. I want to be very clear about something. I do not believe Julia is a bad person. But ambition can change people in ways even they don't notice. I felt my throat tighten. Over the last few years, I've watched her begin to see the world differently. Not emotionally. Strategically. The words were not cruel. They were observational. Measured. I may be wrong, Daniel continued. And I hope I am. But if the day ever comes when Julia believes she understands your life better than you do, I want you to have the power to decide your own future. The final sentence was underlined. You deserve independence, Margaret. Even from the people who love you. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The house felt different now. Not threatened. Guarded. As if Daniel had quietly placed invisible walls around the life we built together. Walls no one, not even our daughter, could dismantle without my permission. And for the first time since overhearing Julia's conversation earlier that afternoon, the fear inside me began to fade. In its place grew something unfamiliar. Clarity. Julia called the next morning. Her voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. Mom. I was thinking about something last night. Of course she was. I found this really lovely assisted living community about 20 minutes from here, she continued. It's not like the old places people imagine. It's more like a resort. I walked slowly through the kitchen as she spoke, touching the back of one of the wooden chairs Daniel had built. I appreciate the concern, I said calmly. But I'm not ready to leave my home. There was a pause on the line. Not long. But long enough. Well, Julia said carefully, it's just something to consider. Her voice had changed slightly. Still warm. But now there was a thin layer of impatience underneath. You shouldn't have to manage such a big property alone. I thought about Daniel's letter. About the trust. About the $1.8 million Julia clearly didn't know existed. I've managed my life quite well so far, I replied. Another pause. Then Julia laughed lightly. Of course you have, Mom. But something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Over the next few weeks, Julia's visits became more frequent. Too frequent. She started arriving unannounced. Walking through the house with a critical eye. Commenting on things she had never noticed before. The stairs are steep. The yard must be exhausting to maintain. The roof might need replacing soon. Each remark sounded practical on the surface. But together they formed a narrative. A story where I was becoming incapable. And Julia was the responsible adult stepping in to help. One afternoon she brought Mark with her. He walked slowly through the living room, examining the windows. Beautiful property, he said. His tone was professional. Not admiring. Evaluating. Julia watched my face carefully. We're just curious what houses in this area are selling for, she said casually. I nodded. Of course. Inside, something important had already shifted. Because now I knew something Julia did not. I knew exactly how much control I still had. That evening, after they left, I made a phone call. It took some searching through Daniel's documents to find the number. But eventually I dialed it. The receptionist answered politely. Strauss and Feldman Law Offices. Yes, I said quietly. My name is Margaret Hale. There was a brief pause. Then the receptionist's voice changed slightly. One moment please. The line clicked. A few seconds later, a calm, confident voice spoke. Mrs. Hale. It was Eleanor Strauss. I've been expecting your call for quite some time. Her words sent a strange chill through me. Expecting it? I asked. Yes. Her voice carried the calm assurance of someone who had been preparing for this moment. Your husband asked me to look out for you if certain circumstances ever arose. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. And what circumstances would those be? There was a brief silence. Then Eleanor answered carefully. The moment you realized you needed to understand the full truth about your finances. For the next hour, Eleanor explained things Daniel had never discussed openly. The trust. The accounts. The protections. And one final safeguard I hadn't yet discovered. A clause buried deep inside the legal structure. A clause designed for one specific scenario. If anyone attempted to manipulate, pressure, or legally challenge my control over the estate, the entire structure would automatically transfer management to Eleanor's firm. Not to family. Not to heirs. To independent oversight. Julia, in other words, could never simply take control. Not without my full consent. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. The maple tree Daniel planted the year Julia was born rustled softly in the wind. And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Peace. But peace has a strange way of revealing truths we might otherwise ignore. Because once I understood how protected I was, a much harder question began to form. Not about money. Not about property. But about my daughter. If Julia truly believed I was helpless. If she believed she could quietly sell my home and move me into assisted living without resistance. Then somewhere along the line, the child I raised had begun seeing me not as a mother, but as a problem to solve. And the most painful realization of all was this. Daniel had seen the possibility long before I did. 2 weeks later, Julia arrived at the house with a folder in her hand. Her smile was bright. Her voice confident. "Mom," she said gently, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "I think it's time we talked seriously about the next chapter of your life." She placed the folder on the table between us. Inside were property listings, assisted living brochures, and a document already prepared for my signature. A document that would give her legal authority over my financial decisions. Julia folded her hands patiently. "You don't have to worry about anything anymore," she said. "I'll take care of everything." I looked down at the paper. Then back at my daughter. And for the first time in my life, I realized something profound. The woman sitting across from me believed she was about to gain control of my future. She had no idea. I was the one holding all the power. Julia slid the document toward me slowly, the way someone might slide a gift across a table. But this was no gift. I recognized the format immediately, even without reading the title. Power of Attorney. Her pen rested neatly beside the papers, angled toward me with quiet expectation. "Mom," she said softly, "this just makes things easier for both of us." The kitchen was unusually quiet that afternoon. Outside, a breeze rustled the maple tree Daniel planted when Julia was born. The branches tapped faintly against the window, like someone politely asking to come inside. I looked down at the document. Then I looked at my daughter. For a moment, the years disappeared. I didn't see the poised corporate professional sitting across from me. I saw the little girl who used to sit at this same table coloring pictures while Daniel cooked pancakes on Saturday mornings. "Mom?" Julia prompted gently. Her smile was patient. Practiced. She believed she already knew how this conversation would end. That realization, more than anything else, made my heart ache. Because somewhere along the way, Julia had stopped seeing me as someone capable of making decisions. She saw me as someone who needed to be managed. "I think," I said slowly, "I'd like to read through everything first." Julia blinked. "Of course," she replied quickly. But the quickness itself betrayed a flicker of irritation. "It's just standard paperwork," she added. "Nothing complicated." I nodded, still holding the papers. Still not signing them. A silence settled between us. It stretched long enough that Julia shifted slightly in her chair. Then she leaned forward. "Mom, you trust me, don't you?" The question landed with surprising weight. Trust. Such a simple word. And yet, over the past few weeks, it had become something fragile. Something easily broken. "I've trusted you your whole life," I said quietly. Her smile returned immediately. "Then this shouldn't be a problem." I closed the folder gently. "I'll review it tonight." Julia's expression froze for half a second. Not anger. Not disappointment. Something closer to confusion. This was not the response she had expected. "That's fine," she said carefully. "But there's really nothing to review. It just allows me to help with bills and property management." I stood slowly and walked to the sink. The act of rinsing my coffee cup gave me a moment to think. Julia had built her strategy around one assumption. That I was unaware. That I was dependent. That I would follow her guidance because I didn't understand the bigger picture. The irony was almost painful. Because now I understood far more than she did. That evening, after Julia left, I called Eleanor Strauss again. She answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Hale." "I have a question," I said. "Of course." "My daughter asked me to sign power of attorney today." There was a pause on the line. Not surprised. Just thoughtful. "And how did you respond?" Eleanor asked. "I told her I'd review it." "Good." The word came calmly. Firmly. Then Eleanor asked the question that mattered most. "Did she explain why she believes it's necessary?" I leaned back in my chair. "She says it will make things easier." Eleanor was silent for a moment. Then she said something that settled into my chest like a stone. "Mrs. Hale, I want to be very clear about something." "Yes?" "Based on the legal protections your husband established, there is no practical reason your daughter would need power of attorney unless she intends to override your direct control over certain assets." My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. "You're saying she wants authority." "I'm saying she wants access." After we ended the call, I sat quietly in the study. Daniel's desk lamp cast a familiar glow across the room. For 12 years, I had thought of myself as the surviving partner in our marriage. The one left behind. But now I realized something unexpected. Daniel had never truly left me unprotected. Even in death, he had anticipated the possibility that someone, even someone we loved, might someday try to steer my life in directions I did not choose. And he had built quiet defenses. Not to control me, but to preserve my freedom. The following week, Julia called again. "Have you signed the paperwork yet?" Her tone was casual. Too casual. "Not yet," I replied. A brief silence followed. "Well," she said, "Mark and I are meeting with a realtor tomorrow. I thought we could start getting a sense of the house's value." My chest tightened slightly. "You're meeting with a realtor?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Just informational." I could almost hear Mark's influence in the background of her thinking. He worked in real estate. Numbers. Valuations. Opportunities. "Julia," I said gently, "why would we need a realtor?" Another pause. This one longer. "Well, eventually the house will have to be sold." The certainty in her voice surprised me. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Because you can't live here forever." The words hung between us. Not cruel, but painfully practical. After the call ended, I walked slowly through the house. The living room where Julia took her first steps. The hallway where Daniel used to measure her height each birthday. The kitchen where our family life had unfolded for decades. I realized something then. Julia wasn't trying to hurt me. Not intentionally. She simply believed she was solving a problem. And in her mind, I was the problem. 2 days later, Julia arrived unexpectedly again. This time Mark came with her. He carried a small measuring device and a clipboard. Just gathering some information, he explained politely. Julia stood beside him, watching my reaction carefully. Mom, we just want to understand the property better. I nodded slowly. Of course. Then I said something that surprised them both. Why don't we sit down first? They exchanged a quick glance. Then followed me into the dining room. The table Daniel built stood solidly in the center of the room. I placed a folder on its surface. Julia's eyes immediately dropped to it. What's that? Information, I said calmly. Her curiosity sharpened. Mark leaned forward slightly. What kind of information? I opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of the trust documents, investment summaries, and Daniel's letter. Julia's eyes moved across the first page. Then the second. Her brow furrowed. What is this? Your father's estate planning. Mark straightened slightly in his chair. Julia flipped another page. Then another. Her breathing changed. These numbers, are these current balances? Yes. Silence fell across the room. The kind of silence that alters relationships. Julia looked up at me slowly. You have, almost $2 million? Her voice sounded distant. Disbelieving. I nodded gently. Your father invested carefully before he passed. She looked down again. Reading more quickly now. Then suddenly her eyes stopped. What's this clause? I knew exactly which one she meant. The protective clause. The one Eleanor had explained. The one Daniel designed for exactly this kind of situation. I folded my hands on the table. It means, I said calmly, that no one can force financial decisions on me. Julia stared at the document. Then at me. Then back at the document. You never told me about any of this. No, I replied softly. I didn't know about it myself until recently. Mark leaned back slowly. His expression had changed completely. No longer confident. Now cautious. Evaluating. Julia's voice came out tighter than before. So the house, the investments, all of it is controlled by this trust? Yes. And the power of attorney? It wouldn't override the trust. Her eyes lifted sharply. You knew that? I met her gaze. Yes. The room felt smaller now. Heavier. For the first time since Daniel died, Julia seemed unsure how to proceed. Her entire plan had been built on one assumption. That I didn't understand the structure of my own life. Now that assumption had collapsed. And suddenly, the conversation between mother and daughter had become something else entirely. Two adults. Facing a truth neither of us had expected to confront. Julia finally closed the folder slowly. You should have told me. Her voice carried frustration now. And something else. Embarrassment. Why? I asked gently. She hesitated. Then looked away. I thought you needed help. The honesty of that sentence softened something inside me. Because beneath the strategy, beneath the ambition, Julia had convinced herself she was doing the responsible thing. Even if the methods were wrong. Even if the respect was missing. Mark stood up quietly. I think this conversation might be better between the two of you, he said carefully. He left the room without waiting for a reply. The front door closed a moment later. Now it was just the two of us. Mother and daughter. Separated by years of unspoken assumptions. Julia stared at the documents again. Then finally asked the question that had been forming in her mind since she opened the folder. Mom, were you ever going to tell me? I took a slow breath. I was waiting for you to ask. She looked up sharply. What do you mean? I said quietly, I wanted to know if you were interested in my life, or only my assets. The words were not angry. But they landed heavily. Julia's shoulders lowered slightly. For the first time that day, she looked less like a strategist and more like a daughter again. And the truth we were both beginning to face was this. The money was never the real issue. The real issue was something far more complicated. Respect. Control. And the fragile, shifting balance between love and power inside a family. Outside, the maple leaves moved gently in the wind. And somewhere deep inside the house Daniel built, the next chapter of our story was just beginning. After Mark left, the house grew strangely quiet. Not the familiar quiet I had known for years, the peaceful kind that settles into old homes like a blanket. This was a different silence. Thicker. Heavy with words that had not yet been spoken. Julia remained seated across from me at the dining table. Her hands rested on the folder, fingers tracing the edges of the documents as if the paper itself might rearrange into a different reality if she waited long enough. Outside, the late afternoon light had shifted toward gold. The maple trees swayed gently in the yard, scattering a few early leaves across the grass Daniel once insisted on mowing himself even when his strength began to fail. Julia finally spoke. You really didn't know about this? Her voice was quieter now. Less certain. No, I said truthfully. Not until a few weeks ago. She looked up slowly. So Dad hid all of this? The word hid carried a trace of accusation. I shook my head gently. Protected, I corrected. Julia's lips pressed together. For a moment she looked very much like the teenager she used to be when a teacher challenged her in class, thinking quickly, reorganizing her thoughts, searching for a new angle. But why? She asked. The question hung in the air. Why indeed? I thought about Daniel's letter again. About the careful wording. About the quiet way he had written about ambition. Your father believed in preparation, I said softly. Julia leaned back in her chair. That sounds like a diplomatic way of saying he didn't trust me. The directness of her words caught me off guard. Julia. It's fine, she said quickly, though the tightness in her voice suggested otherwise. She closed the folder and pushed it slightly away from her. I guess I just wish he'd talk to me about it. I studied my daughter's face. The confident corporate strategist who had arrived earlier with plans and paperwork now looked unsettled. Vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in years. And suddenly I realized something important. Julia hadn't come here expecting a confrontation. She had come expecting compliance. Her entire plan had been built around the idea that she was the responsible adult managing a fragile situation. Discovering that she had misunderstood the situation entirely had shifted the ground beneath her feet. For the first time in a long while, she was uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" I said gently. Julia nodded. "Why did you want the power of attorney?" Her eyes moved toward the window. For several seconds she didn't answer. Then she sighed. "Because I thought it would make things easier." Easier for who? That question seemed to land deeper than the first. Julia's shoulders lowered slightly. "For both of us," she said, though the words carried less confidence now. I waited. Sometimes silence reveals more than pressure ever could. And eventually Julia filled the silence. "You don't understand how complicated things get as people get older," she continued. "Medical decisions. Property taxes. Insurance claims." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, slipping into the familiar rhythm of professional explanation. "I deal with these situations all the time with clients' families." "I'm not one of your clients," I said softly. Julia stopped speaking. Her eyes returned to mine. "No," she admitted. "You're my mother." The word mother lingered between us. But there was something fragile about it now. As if we were both trying to remember exactly what it meant. "Mom," Julia said after a moment, "you have to admit this house is a lot to manage." "It's the same house I've managed for 43 years. That was when Dad was here." I didn't answer immediately. Instead I looked around the room. The dining table Daniel built. The worn groove in the floor near the kitchen doorway where Julia used to run back and forth as a child. Every inch of this place held layers of time. "This house isn't just a building," I said quietly. Julia exhaled slowly. "I know that." "Do you?" She hesitated. Then said something that surprised me. "I think I forgot." The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. Not defensive. Not strategic. Just tired. Julia rubbed her temples. "You have no idea what my life has been like these past few years," she said quietly. I waited. Again, silence did its work. "You know Mark works in real estate," she continued. "Yes. The market's been unpredictable." I noticed the way she chose her words. Carefully. As if stepping across thin ice. "And your job?" I asked. Julia gave a small, humorless laugh. "My job is complicated." That word again. Complicated. Suddenly a memory surfaced. Julia at 15, standing in this very room after failing her first major math exam. "I just didn't want to tell you because it was complicated," she had said back then. The same tone. The same guarded expression. "Julia," I said gently. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Her head snapped up. "No." Too quickly. Too sharply. And just like that, I knew. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Julia stared at the table. Her fingers tapped lightly against the wood. A small, nervous rhythm she had never quite outgrown. I didn't push. Eventually she spoke again. "My company restructured last year." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm technically still employed." The phrasing made my stomach tighten. "Technically?" Julia let out a slow breath. "They moved me into a contract role." The puzzle pieces began shifting quietly into place. "And the income?" I asked carefully. "Variable." There it was. The truth, finally starting to emerge. Julia leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "I didn't want you worrying about me," she said. "Instead you tried to take control of my life." She closed her eyes briefly. "That wasn't the plan." "What was the plan?" Julia hesitated again. Then finally said it. "I thought if we sold the house, we could simplify things." "We." Such a small word. But suddenly I understood what it meant. "You needed the money," I said quietly. Julia's silence confirmed it. For a long time neither of us spoke. Outside, dusk had begun to settle across the yard. The maple leaves moved softly in the evening breeze. Finally Julia whispered something I never expected to hear. "I'm scared, Mom." The admission hung in the room like something fragile. Julia Hale, the confident strategist who had built her life around control and planning, was sitting across from me admitting fear. "What happened?" I asked gently. Her eyes filled slightly, though she blinked the moisture away quickly. "Mark and I invested in a development project last year." My heart sank slightly. "Real estate?" She nodded. "It was supposed to be a sure thing." There is no phrase in the financial world more dangerous than sure thing. "What went wrong?" Julia let out a long breath. "The city pulled zoning approval." I didn't know the details of real estate law, but I understood enough to recognize the consequences. "And the investment?" "Gone." The truth finally stood fully between us. Julia hadn't come here as a villain. She had come here as someone desperate. Desperate people sometimes convince themselves that practical solutions justify uncomfortable choices. Selling the house. Moving me into assisted living. Consolidating assets. From her perspective, it had probably seemed logical. Responsible even. But somewhere in that logic, she had forgotten to ask the most important question. Whether it was her decision to make. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," Julia said quietly. "I know. I thought, maybe if we combined resources." Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The meaning was clear. I looked at the folder again. The trust documents. Daniel's careful planning. The protection he built not out of suspicion, but foresight. And suddenly I understood something about my husband I had never fully appreciated while he was alive. Daniel hadn't been protecting me from Julia. He had been protecting Julia from herself. I reached across the table and gently closed the folder. "Julia," I said softly. "Yes?" "We need to talk about something much more important than money." She looked up slowly. "What?" "Respect." The word landed with quiet gravity. Because in that moment both of us understood the truth we had been circling all afternoon. Money can complicate families. But it rarely destroys them on its own. What destroys them is the moment someone stops seeing the other person as an equal human being. And begins seeing them as a problem to manage. Julia stared at the table for a long time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I owe you an apology." Outside, the wind moved gently through the maple leaves. And somewhere deep inside the house Daniel built, the long process of rebuilding trust had finally begun. Julia's apology did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, like something fragile being carried across a narrow bridge. "I think I owe you an apology," she had said. But the words hung in the air after that, unfinished. Because apologies, real ones, are rarely a single sentence. They are a process, one that requires the person speaking them to walk through uncomfortable truths before they can finally set the words down. Julia sat across from me, staring at the wooden grain of the table Daniel had built with his own hands. Her fingers moved slowly across its surface, tracing the small imperfections that had always given it character. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said finally. I nodded gently. "I believe you." She looked up, surprised. "You do?" "Yes." That seemed to disarm her more than anger would have. Julia had likely prepared herself for confrontation, for accusations, maybe even outrage. But calm understanding left her without the defensive armor she had quietly assembled. "I just thought I was solving a problem," she continued. "You were solving your problem," I said softly. Julia winced slightly. "Yes," she admitted. The kitchen lights cast a warm glow across the room as evening settled outside. The house had grown darker around us, but the space between mother and daughter was finally beginning to fill with something that had been missing for a long time. Honesty. Julia leaned back in her chair and rubbed her face. "I should probably tell you the rest," she said. I didn't interrupt. She took a slow breath. The development project Mark and I invested in wasn't small. "How much?" I asked carefully. Julia hesitated. Then answered. 600,000. For a moment the number simply floated in the air. $600,000. Nearly the entire value of this house. "You invested that much?" I asked quietly. "Not exactly." Julia looked at the floor. "We borrowed against Mark's business. And when the zoning failed, the bank called the loan." The story was becoming clearer. And heavier. "Mark's company is on the line," she continued. "Everything?" "Everything." The magnitude of it settled slowly over the room. This wasn't just a financial inconvenience. It was collapse. Mark's livelihood. Julia's stability. Their entire future. And suddenly the pieces of the past few months arranged themselves into a picture I had not fully understood before. The urgency in Julia's voice. The pressure to sell the house quickly. The push for power of attorney. From her perspective, she had been trying to solve a crisis. But in doing so, she had crossed a boundary she had never even noticed existed. The boundary between helping a parent and controlling them. "Does Mark know about the trust?" I asked. Julia shook her head immediately. "No." "Why not?" "Because." I didn't know until today. I studied her face carefully. "You didn't tell him what you thought my finances looked like?" Julia hesitated. Then sighed. "I told him the house was probably our best option." "Our." The word again. But this time it sounded less like strategy and more like regret. "What happens now?" I asked gently. Julia gave a small, helpless laugh. "That's a very good question." The honesty in her tone told me something important. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Julia didn't have a plan. Her entire career had been built around anticipating outcomes, controlling variables, staying several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Now she was standing in unfamiliar territory. Uncertainty. We sat quietly for several minutes. Then Julia said something unexpected. "Do you hate me?" The vulnerability in the question made my chest ache. "No," I said softly. She looked relieved. Then ashamed. "I think I might hate myself a little right now." That honesty felt heavier than anything else she had said all evening. Because it meant she understood what had happened. Not just financially. Emotionally. "I didn't see you clearly," Julia said after a moment. "What do you mean?" "I stopped thinking of you as a person with your own life." The words were painful to hear. But also necessary. "I thought of you as someone I needed to take care of." I nodded slowly. "And in doing that," she continued, "I stopped asking what you wanted." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. A few leaves scraped softly against the window. The sound reminded me of autumn evenings years ago when Julia used to sit beside Daniel on the couch, asking endless questions about the world. What happens to the leaves when they fall? Where do birds go in the winter? Why do grown-ups worry so much? Children see life with simple clarity. Adulthood complicates everything. "Julia," I said quietly. "Yes?" "You need to understand something." She looked up. "The money your father left, the trust, none of it was meant to punish you." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Then why did he set it up this way?" I thought carefully before answering. "Because he believed independence matters." "For you?" "For both of us." Julia tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" "Your father didn't want me dependent on you. And he also didn't want you dependent on me." The meaning of that statement took a moment to sink in. Julia's eyes moved slowly toward the folder again. "So even if I asked for help, the trust doesn't automatically give you access." Her shoulders lowered slightly. "I figured. But that doesn't mean help is impossible," I added. Julia looked up quickly. "You'd help me?" The hope in her voice was unmistakable. "And complicated. Because helping someone financially is rarely just about money. It's about boundaries, expectations, and the fragile balance between support and dependence." "I didn't say that," I replied gently. Julia nodded slowly. "That's fair." For the next hour we talked in a way we hadn't talked in years. Not as strategist and problem. Not as parent and child trapped in old patterns. But as two adults trying to understand the choices that had brought us here. Julia explained the development deal in detail. How Mark's firm had partnered with investors. How the zoning board's unexpected reversal had frozen construction. How the lenders had moved quickly once delays began. Each step of the story carried the same underlying theme. Confidence. Followed by shock. Followed by panic. And panic, I realized, had been the real driver behind Julia's decisions these past few months. Panic disguised as practicality. Eventually the clock on the kitchen wall ticked past 10. Julia looked exhausted. So did I. "Mark is probably wondering where I am," she said quietly. "Does he know you came here tonight?" "No." "Will you tell him about the trust?" Julia hesitated. "I don't know yet." That answer made sense. Because the truth she had discovered tonight didn't just affect her relationship with me. It changed the dynamics of her entire life. Julia stood slowly. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor. For a moment she looked around the room, taking it in with new eyes. "I think this might be the first time in years I've really looked at this house," she said quietly. "What do you see?" She smiled faintly. "History." Then she added something that surprised me. "And mistakes." I raised an eyebrow slightly. My mistakes, she clarified. She moved toward the front door slowly. Then paused. Mom? Yes? Thank you for not throwing me out tonight. The sincerity in her voice made me smile softly. You're still my daughter. Julia nodded. But before she left, she said one more thing. Something that carried both humility and uncertainty. I don't know what happens next. I thought about that for a moment. Then answered honestly. Neither do I. The front door closed quietly behind her. The house settled back into silence. I walked slowly through the living room, turning off lights one by one. Finally I returned to Daniel's study. The folder still rested on his desk. I opened it again and looked at his letter. His careful handwriting. His quiet foresight. And suddenly I understood something about the situation Julia and I now faced. The trust Daniel built had protected my independence. But it had also created something else. A moment of choice. Not obligation. Choice. For the first time since Julia was a little girl, I had the freedom to decide exactly what kind of mother I wanted to be. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching rain. The maple leaves rustled softly in the dark. And somewhere between past and future, I realized the hardest decision of my life was still waiting. Because sometimes the greatest test of independence is deciding whether to help someone who once tried to control you. And I still didn't know what my answer would be. The rain came sometime after midnight. I woke to the soft drumming of it against the roof, steady, patient, the kind of rain that settles in for the night rather than passing through quickly. For years after Daniel died, nights like this had been the hardest. Silence has a way of becoming louder when someone who once shared it with you is gone. But lately, the silence had changed again. Now it carried the echo of Julia's voice from earlier that evening. Do you hate me? The question had stayed with me long after she left. Because beneath everything else, the money, the house, the trust, that question revealed the real fear she was carrying. Not bankruptcy. Not failure. Loss. Loss of something that once felt permanent. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I lay in bed thinking about the strange ways families shift over time. When Julia was little, she needed me for everything. Shoes tied. Homework checked. Nightmares chased away. Then one day, almost without noticing, the balance changed. She began solving her own problems. Making her own plans. Building a life that slowly grew beyond the boundaries of this house. That is the quiet goal of every parent, to raise someone strong enough to leave. But what no one tells you is how complicated it becomes when that person eventually turns back toward you again. Especially when they're not sure whether they're coming home. Or asking for something you may not be able to give. The next morning arrived gray and damp. Rain still clung to the windows as I moved slowly through the kitchen, making coffee the way Daniel had taught me, too strong for most people, but perfect for quiet mornings. The house felt thoughtful. That's the only word I can use to describe it. As if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. I had just sat down with my mug when my phone rang. The caller ID surprised me. Julia. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Not out of anger. Simply because we had both said so much the night before. But something told me the story wasn't finished yet. I answered. Good morning, I said gently. Julia's voice sounded different. Tighter. Mom, are you home? Yes. There was a pause. I need to talk to you. You're always welcome. Another silence. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. Mark knows. 40 minutes later, Julia pulled into the driveway. I watched from the living room window as she stepped out of her car. She looked tired. Not just physically, but in the deeper way people look when the structure of their plans begins to collapse. She knocked softly before letting herself in. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi." For a moment we simply stood there. Then she walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. The same chair she had used the night before. "Did you tell him?" I asked. Julia nodded. "I didn't mean to." "What happened?" She let out a slow breath. "He found the paperwork in my bag." I could imagine the scene easily enough. Mark asking questions. Julia trying to explain. The delicate balance between partners suddenly shifting. "What did he say?" I asked. Julia rubbed her forehead. "At first he thought I was joking. And then he got very quiet." She stared down at her hands for a moment before continuing. "He asked why I hadn't told him sooner." That seemed like a reasonable question. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Julia looked up. "I told him I didn't know until yesterday." "And did he believe you?" "I think so." Her tone suggested uncertainty. "What else did he say?" I asked gently. Julia hesitated. Then answered. "He wants to come talk to you." The idea did not surprise me. People facing financial collapse rarely remain calm for long. Desperation has a way of creating urgency. "Why?" I asked. Julia sighed. "Because he thinks you might be able to help." There it was. The moment the conversation shifted from family tension into financial pressure. "And what do you think?" I asked quietly. Julia looked at me for a long time before answering. "I think that's a terrible idea." That response caught me off guard. "Why?" "Because if he comes here asking for money, it changes everything." She gestured vaguely toward the room. "Everything we talked about last night." Her honesty surprised me again. "You're worried it would damage our relationship further," I said. "Yes." "And yet you told him about the trust." Julia gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I didn't exactly have a choice." We sat quietly for a moment. Rain still tapped gently against the windows. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Then Julia asked something unexpected. "Can I ask you a strange question?" "Of course." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you think Dad would help?" The question lingered. Because it required me to imagine a man who was no longer here making decisions in a world that had changed since he left it. "I think," I said carefully, "your father believed strongly in consequences." Julia nodded slowly. "That sounds like him." "But he also believed in second chances." Her eyes lifted. "That also sounds like him." "But he also believed in second chances." Her eyes lifted. "That also sounds like him." Julia leaned back in her chair. "He's going to come anyway," she said. "Mark?" "Yes." "When?" She glanced at her phone. "Probably this afternoon." I absorbed that quietly. "Does he know where you are right now?" "Yes." "And he's coming here?" Julia nodded. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said something very simple. "I'm sorry." The words were different from the apology she had offered the night before. Less formal. More personal. I know, I said softly. She nodded. But I'm still sorry. By early afternoon the rain had stopped. The clouds hung low over the neighborhood, turning the light outside soft and gray. Julia paced occasionally through the living room, glancing at her phone. I remained in the kitchen, reading Daniel's letter again. There was something comforting about the steady confidence of his handwriting. He had believed life could become unpredictable. But he had also believed people were capable of finding their way back to each other. Eventually. At 3 o'clock a car pulled into the driveway. Julia looked up immediately. That's him. Through the window I saw Mark step out. His posture was stiff. Determined. Julia stood near the doorway as he approached. For a brief moment I wondered whether she might tell him to leave. But she didn't. The doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house Daniel built. And suddenly it felt as though the quiet life I had lived here for the past 12 years was standing at a crossroads. Because the man on the other side of that door wasn't just a visitor. He represented pressure. Expectation. And the possibility that the fragile understanding Julia and I had begun rebuilding might be tested far sooner than either of us had hoped. Julia looked at me. What do you want to do? I stood slowly. Walked toward the door. And answered with the only truth I had. Let's find out what he has to say. The door opened. Mark stood there, rainwater still clinging to his jacket. His expression was polite. But beneath the politeness, I could already see something else. Desperation. And desperation, I knew, often leads people to ask for things they never imagined asking before. Mrs. Hale, he said carefully. Thank you for seeing me. I stepped aside. Come in. Because sometimes the only way to understand what the future will demand of you is to let it walk through the front door. Mark stepped inside carefully, as if the house itself required a certain level of respect. People sometimes behave that way in homes filled with history. Something about the quiet presence of decades makes even confident men speak more softly. He wiped his shoes on the mat and glanced around the living room. This place is beautiful, he said. It wasn't flattery. Not exactly. More like acknowledgement. Julia stood near the hallway, arms folded loosely, watching both of us with a mixture of tension and regret. Would you like some coffee? I asked. Mark shook his head quickly. No, thank you. His voice carried a controlled urgency. He wasn't here for small talk. We moved into the dining room, the same place Julia and I had spoken the night before. The folder still rested on the table. Mark noticed it immediately. His eyes lingered on the documents inside before he sat down. Julia remained standing for a moment, then slowly took the chair beside him. For a few seconds no one spoke. The kind of silence that gathers before difficult conversations. Finally Mark cleared his throat. Mrs. Hale. Julia told me about the trust. I nodded. Yes. I want to start by saying something very clearly. His voice steadied slightly. I'm not here to pressure you. That sentence told me exactly how worried he was about appearing desperate. I'm glad to hear that, I replied calmly. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. But I do need to explain the situation. Mark spoke carefully. Not emotionally. Like someone presenting information during a business meeting. But beneath the controlled tone I could hear the strain. The development project Julia mentioned last night was a mixed-use property downtown, he began. Retail and residential. Julia stared down at the table while he spoke. We secured financing through a private investment group, he continued. At first everything looked stable. The city planning board approved the preliminary zoning. Then he paused. And then the environmental review committee stepped in. Julia closed her eyes briefly. Mark noticed but kept talking. They raised concerns about soil contamination from an old manufacturing site nearby. I understood enough about local politics to know what that meant. Delays. Investigations. Lawyers. We tried to push the process forward, Mark said. But once the delays hit 6 months, our lenders activated a clause in the financing agreement. The loan was recalled, I said quietly. He nodded. Yes. The air in the room felt heavier now. Julia finally spoke. They gave us 90 days to repay the balance. Mark added quietly, or the property transfers to them along with our collateral. And the collateral is? Mark didn't answer immediately. Julia did. Mark's company. The words settled slowly over the table. Mark's company. His entire livelihood. Years of work. Reputation. All tied to a project that had collapsed because of something no one could have predicted. How much is still owed? I asked. Mark answered directly. 580,000. The number hung in the room. Julia shifted slightly in her chair. Mark looked at me carefully. We've been trying to restructure the loan. And? The investors aren't interested. Of course they weren't. Investors prefer certainty. And desperation rarely inspires confidence. Mark leaned back slightly. Julia thought selling the house might help solve the problem. He said it gently. Without accusation. But the implication was clear. Julia's idea had not been his alone. He had simply agreed to it. Julia looked up. I thought we could move you somewhere comfortable, she said quietly. I wasn't trying to throw you out. I know, I replied. Mark watched the exchange carefully. Then he spoke again. When Julia told me about the trust this morning, it changed things. How? Because it means the solution we thought existed, doesn't. Julia exhaled slowly. Mark continued. I told her I wanted to speak with you directly. Julia glanced at him quickly. I told you that was a bad idea. I know, Mark said. But I still felt I should come. His eyes met mine. Not to demand anything. To explain. For a moment none of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been quietly forming in my mind. Are you asking me for money? Mark did not look away. Yes. The honesty surprised me. But honesty, even when uncomfortable, has a certain dignity. How much? I asked. 200,000 would stabilize the loan long enough for us to refinance. Julia's head snapped toward him. You said 150. Mark looked at her. That was before I spoke to the bank again this morning. The tension between them flickered briefly across the table. Julia turned back toward me. Mom, you don't have to even consider this. Mark nodded. She's right. That seemed almost contradictory. But then he added quietly. I know this is a lot to ask. I looked at the folder again. Daniel's careful planning. The investments. The protections. The independence he had worked so hard to preserve for me. And suddenly the weight of the moment became very clear. Helping them would not simply be a financial decision. It would change the balance of everything Daniel had designed. Because once money enters a family relationship, expectations follow close behind. And expectations can quietly reshape the future. Why 200,000? I asked. Mark answered calmly. Because that amount shows the lenders we still have liquidity. And if I don't help? He didn't hesitate. My company collapses. Julia spoke softly beside him. And our life with it. The honesty in that sentence made the room very quiet. I studied both of them. Julia looked exhausted. Mark looked determined. Neither of them looked entitled. Just frightened. And suddenly I understood something important. This moment wasn't about greed. It was about survival. I stood slowly and walked to the window. The rain had stopped completely now. Late afternoon light filtered through the clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement outside. For years after Daniel died, I had believed my life had entered its quietest chapter. But standing there, looking out at the maple tree we planted when Julia was born, I realized something unexpected. Life doesn't really have quiet chapters. It only has moments when we think the difficult decisions are behind us. Until suddenly they're not. Behind me, Julia spoke softly. You don't owe us anything. Mark added quietly. She's right. Their words were sincere. But desperation still filled the room. I turned back toward the table. The folder remained open. Daniel's letter resting inside. For a moment I imagined what he might say if he were sitting here with us now. He would probably listen carefully. Ask precise questions. Consider long-term consequences. Daniel had never been impulsive. But he had also never been cruel. Mark, I said finally. Yes? If I helped you, what happens next? He answered immediately. We refinance the loan within 90 days. And if that fails? Mark hesitated. Then said the only honest thing he could. Then you would likely lose the money. Julia closed her eyes briefly. The truth had finally been spoken out loud. I walked back to the table slowly. Julia watched me with quiet apprehension. Mark remained very still. The decision sitting between us carried enormous weight. Not just financially. Emotionally. Because helping them would require something far more complicated than writing a check. It would require trust. Trust that the same daughter who had once tried to take control of my future would now respect the boundaries protecting it. I rested my hand gently on the folder. And said the only thing I could say with certainty. I need time to think. Julia nodded immediately. Of course. Mark stood slowly. Thank you for hearing us out. They moved toward the door together. But before leaving, Julia turned back. Her voice was soft. Almost fragile. No matter what you decide. I'm glad we talked. I nodded gently. So am I. The door closed quietly behind them. The house settled again into its familiar stillness. I returned to Daniel's study. Opened his letter one more time. And read the final line again. You deserve independence, Margaret. The question now was simple. Would helping Julia protect our relationship? Or slowly destroy the independence Daniel had worked so carefully to preserve? And for the first time since this story began, I realized something else. The hardest part of being a parent isn't raising your child. It's deciding what to do when that child comes back needing something you might not be able to give. After Julia and Mark left, the house felt different again. Not quieter. Heavier. The kind of stillness that settles over a place after something important has been said but nothing has been decided. I remained in Daniel's study long after their car disappeared down the street. The folder rested open on the desk. His letter lay on top of the trust documents, the familiar slope of his handwriting somehow steadier than my own thoughts. $200,000. The number kept repeating in my mind like a distant echo. For some families, it might have been an impossible amount. For me, thanks to Daniel's quiet foresight, it was something else entirely. A possibility. But possibilities carry consequences. And Daniel had spent his entire life thinking about consequences. I read his letter again slowly. Not just the words. The intention behind them. You deserve independence, Margaret. At first, when I discovered the trust, I thought Daniel had been protecting me from Julia. But now, after everything that had happened over the past 2 days, I realized something more complicated. Daniel hadn't been trying to prevent me from helping anyone. He had been making sure that if I ever chose to help, it would truly be my choice. Not something taken from me. Not something manipulated. Choice. That was the real gift he left behind. I picked up the phone and dialed Eleanor Strauss. It was early evening, but she answered quickly. Mrs. Hale. I'm sorry to bother you again, I said. You're not bothering me. Her voice carried the calm steadiness I had come to appreciate. What's on your mind? I took a breath. My daughter and her partner asked me for financial help today. Eleanor did not sound surprised. How much? 200,000. There was a short pause. Then she asked the most important question. And what do you want to do? I hesitated. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Eleanor didn't rush to give advice. That was one of the things Daniel had always respected about her. Instead, she asked questions. Careful ones. Do you believe they're telling the truth about the situation? Yes. Do you believe they expect you to say yes? I thought about Julia's face when she left. The mix of hope and guilt in her eyes. I think they're afraid I might, I said quietly. Eleanor gave a small thoughtful hum. That's a very honest answer. I leaned back in the chair. There's something else I'm worried about. What's that? If I help them, does it weaken the trust? Not legally. And personally? Eleanor paused longer this time. Mrs. Hale, financial assistance within families is always complicated. Yes. The question you should ask yourself isn't whether helping them changes the trust. What should I ask? Whether helping them changes you. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in the dim light of the study. Eleanor's words lingered. Whether helping them changes you. It was a strange way of framing the decision. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood what she meant. Because money has a way of altering relationships in subtle ways. Sometimes the person who gives begins to feel responsible for outcomes they can't control. And sometimes the person who receives begins to feel either indebted or entitled. Neither outcome is healthy. That night I walked through the house slowly. The living room. The hallway. The kitchen. Each room carried memories layered like old photographs. Julia learning to ride her bike in the driveway. Daniel repairing the sink one Christmas Eve while laughing at his own terrible timing. Birthday candles. Arguments. Ordinary moments that quietly become the foundation of a life. Standing there, I realized something important. This house had survived every stage of Julia's life. Childhood, teenage rebellion, college departures, adult distance. And now, somehow, it had become the center of another turning point. Not just financially, emotionally. The next morning, the sky cleared. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, making the maple leaves outside glow bright gold. Autumn had arrived fully overnight. I had just poured my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. A message from Julia. Mark met with the bank this morning. They've shortened the timeline. My stomach tightened slightly. I typed back. How much time? Her response came quickly. 30 days. 30 days. I set the phone down slowly. The pressure was increasing. Banks have a way of moving quickly once they decide a situation is unstable. A failed project. A recalled loan. Now a shortened timeline. Mark and Julia weren't just facing financial difficulty. They were racing against time. Later that afternoon, Julia called. Can I come over? She asked. Of course. Her car arrived 20 minutes later. This time she came alone. She looked tired again. But calmer somehow. I talked to Mark after the bank meeting, she said as soon as she sat down. And? He understands that asking you for help might not be fair. That's thoughtful of him. Julia gave a small smile. He's still terrified. I imagine so. She leaned forward slightly. I want you to know something. Yes? If you say no, I'll accept it. Her voice carried quiet determination. No guilt. No pressure. That means a lot to hear. She nodded. But I also want to be honest. I waited. I'm scared we're going to lose everything. The vulnerability in that sentence reminded me of something Daniel used to say. Fear strips away the illusions people build around themselves. What remains is the truth. Julia stared at her coffee cup. You know what the worst part is, she said softly. What? I didn't even ask you before making plans with your house. The shame in her voice was unmistakable. I convinced myself I was helping. I nodded gently. Sometimes helping and controlling can look very similar. Julia gave a small sad laugh. Yeah. I figured that out. We sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked something unexpected. Can I ask you a strange question? Go ahead. If Dad were here, do you think he'd forgive me? The question caught me off guard. But I understood where it came from. Julia wasn't just worried about money. She was worried about how her father would see her now. I think, I said slowly, your father believed people are more than their worst decisions. Julia's eyes softened slightly. That sounds like him. But he also believed mistakes should teach us something. Her smile faded just a little. That definitely sounds like him. As the afternoon passed, we talked about things we hadn't discussed in years. Julia's childhood. Daniel's quiet habits. The strange ways families drift apart and sometimes drift back together again. By the time the sun began setting, the tension that had filled the house earlier felt different. Still present. But softer. Less like conflict. More like uncertainty shared between two people trying to find their way forward. Eventually Julia stood to leave. At the door she paused. Mom? Yes? I meant what I said earlier. What's that? If you decide not to help, I'll understand. I studied her face carefully. And for the first time in a long while, I saw something new there. Respect. Not the polite respect of a professional adult speaking to an aging parent. Real respect. The kind that comes from recognizing someone else's autonomy. After she left, I returned once more to Daniel's study. The folder remained on the desk. His letter resting quietly inside. But this time when I looked at it, something inside me had shifted. Because I had finally realized what Daniel had truly given me. Not just money. Not just protection. Freedom. Freedom to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. Even when the decision was difficult. Outside, the sun dipped below the trees. The sky turned a deep shade of amber. And as I sat there in the fading light, the answer I had been searching for finally began to form. Not an easy answer. But a clear one. And tomorrow, I would tell Julia. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give your child isn't money. It's a decision that teaches them something far more valuable. That night I slept better than I had in days. Not because the situation had improved. If anything, the pressure surrounding Julia and Mark had only increased. 30 days was not much time to solve a financial crisis involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. But something inside me had finally settled. For the first time since this story began, I knew what I was going to do. And strangely enough, the answer had nothing to do with money. Morning arrived quietly. The kind of crisp autumn morning Daniel used to love. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, touching the maple leaves outside until they glowed a warm shade of gold. I stood at the counter making coffee and thought about all the mornings that had come before this one. Julia rushing through the kitchen before school. Daniel reading the newspaper at the table. The ordinary rhythm of family life that somehow feels permanent when you're living inside it. But permanence is an illusion. Families change. Children grow. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they find their way back to you when life becomes complicated. At 9 o'clock I called Julia. She answered immediately. "Hi, Mom." Her voice carried the careful tone of someone trying not to sound anxious. "Good morning. How are you?" "I'm all right." There was a pause. The kind that happens when both people know a conversation is coming. "I've made a decision," I said gently. Julia didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her voice was quieter. "Okay. Can you come over?" "Yes. I'd like Mark to be here too." Another pause. Then, "All right." They arrived about 40 minutes later. This time the tension between them was visible the moment they walked through the door. Mark looked like someone who hadn't slept much. Julia looked like someone who had spent the entire drive thinking about possibilities she couldn't control. We sat down in the dining room again. The same table. The same folder. But the atmosphere felt different now. Less uncertain. More like the moment before a verdict. Mark spoke first. "Thank you for seeing us again." "You're welcome." Julia watched my face carefully. I could see the nervous hope in her eyes. But also something new. Acceptance. She had prepared herself for the possibility that my answer might be no. And that mattered more than she probably realized. "I spent a long time thinking last night," I began. Julia nodded slowly. "I talked with my lawyer again." Mark's shoulders straightened slightly. That wasn't surprising. Lawyers usually mean boundaries. I understand exactly what helping you would involve, I continued. Neither of them interrupted. Good. Listening is sometimes the first sign people are ready to hear difficult truths. I also understand the risk, I said. Mark nodded. We've tried to be honest about that. Yes. You have. I rested my hand lightly on the folder. The money exists. Julia swallowed slightly. But that doesn't mean giving it away is simple. Of course, Mark said quickly. You're absolutely right. I looked at both of them carefully. I'm willing to help. Julia's eyes widened. Mark let out a breath he had clearly been holding for several minutes. But before either of them could speak, I raised my hand slightly. There are conditions. Julia nodded immediately. That's fair. Mark leaned forward. What kind of conditions? I closed the folder and folded my hands on the table. First, I said calmly, this will not be a gift. Their expressions shifted slightly. Julia looked relieved. Mark looked thoughtful. It will be a loan, I continued. With formal documentation prepared by Eleanor Strauss. Mark nodded quickly. That makes perfect sense. Interest will be minimal, I added. But repayment will still be required. Julia spoke softly. That's completely reasonable. I continued. Second condition. Both of them waited. You will not make financial decisions involving my assets ever again. Julia lowered her eyes slightly. That's fair. No discussions about selling the house. Understood. No assumptions about my future. Julia nodded again. I promise. I took a slow breath. Third condition. This one mattered the most. If I help you, the two of you will attend financial counseling. Mark blinked slightly. Julia looked surprised. Counseling, she repeated. Yes. I leaned back slightly. Someone who specializes in investment risk and business planning. Mark frowned thoughtfully. You mean like an advisor? More than that. I met his eyes. Someone who helps people understand why they make certain financial decisions. Julia looked down at the table again. And suddenly I saw something shift in her expression. Recognition. Because deep down she knew this wasn't just about a failed development project. It was about the pattern that had led her there. Confidence. Control. The belief that smart people can always outmaneuver risk. I want you both to learn from this, I said gently. Not just survive it. Mark sat back slowly. That's actually a very good idea. Julia nodded quietly. I think we probably need it. Silence settled across the table. But this time it felt lighter. More like relief than tension. Then Mark asked the question he had probably been holding since the conversation began. How much are you willing to lend? I held his gaze for a moment. Then answered. 150,000. Julia looked surprised. Not 200? No. Mark leaned forward slightly. That might still help. I know. Julia tilted her head. Why that amount? I smiled gently. Because problems that large should never have only one solution. They both stared at me for a moment. Then Mark nodded slowly. You're forcing us to solve part of the problem ourselves. Yes. Julia's lips curved into a small smile. That definitely sounds like something Dad would do. The tension in the room eased a little. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. If we can secure the rest through refinancing, that might actually work. Julia looked hopeful for the first time in days. I think it might. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the maple leaves swayed gently in the wind. Autumn had fully arrived now. Change had settled over everything. And standing there, I realized something that made my chest feel unexpectedly light. This decision wasn't about rescuing Julia. It was about trusting that she could still grow from the experience. When I turned back toward the table, Julia was watching me. Her eyes were bright. Not with desperation this time. With something else. Gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. Mark nodded. We won't forget this. I smiled gently. I hope you don't. Because the truth was simple. Money can solve problems. But lessons are what prevent those problems from returning. And the lesson Julia needed most right now had nothing to do with investments. It had to do with humility. Later that afternoon, after they left, I returned to Daniel's study. The letter still rested on the desk. I picked it up again. Read the final line one more time. You deserve independence, Margaret. For the first time since discovering the trust, I smiled. Because Daniel had been right. Independence wasn't just about protecting myself. Sometimes it was about choosing how to help others. Without losing yourself in the process. Outside, the wind carried a few maple leaves across the yard. Another season quietly beginning. And somewhere inside that quiet change, Julia and I had begun something new. Not the relationship we once had. But perhaps something stronger. Two adults. Learning, finally, how to respect each other. Weeks passed in a strange rhythm. Julia and Mark had returned to their own routines, Mark managing the construction site with a renewed sense of urgency, Julia juggling calls with investors, spreadsheets, and client concerns. But something fundamental had shifted. I could tell because the calls and texts I received from Julia no longer carried the edge of tension or veiled guilt. She was slower to panic, more deliberate in her responses, as if she'd finally learned how to measure not only the cost of her choices, but the ripple they created. I, too, discovered a subtle shift in myself. The anxiety that had clawed at my chest every time I opened the banking app or reviewed the trust documents had loosened. My nights, once sleepless with worry, were now filled with pages of notes and journals, reflections on my own decisions, on parenting, on trust, and on the unspoken lessons Daniel had embedded in every careful line of that letter. One evening, as amber light spilled across the living room, I sat at the piano Daniel had once played, hands hovering over keys I hadn't touched in years. Music had always been my refuge, and tonight I let it remind me of a truth I'd rediscovered. Control is a myth. You cannot force people to do the right thing. You can only offer guidance, set boundaries, and let them choose. Then, one crisp Thursday morning, Julia called. Mom, she said, voice unusually calm, I think we did it. I leaned back in my chair, heart lifting cautiously. Tell me everything. The refinancing had gone through, the investors had approved a partial restructuring, and Mark's company had stabilized enough to cover the remaining obligations. It was not a windfall, not an instant restoration of wealth, but a lifeline, one that Julia and Mark had secured themselves, with my help as a bridge rather than a crutch. I can't believe you trusted us enough to make us do this on our own, Julia whispered, almost shyly. I didn't trust you blindly, I said, I trusted that you were capable of learning. And I knew that if you faced the consequences directly, you'd understand their weight. There was a pause, the kind that comes when people absorb the depth of what's been said. "I understand," she said finally. "And I won't forget it." Over the next few months, our interactions changed fundamentally. No longer were they the daughter and son-in-law I had to monitor, no longer the source of constant fear and frustration. They were partners in a complex, careful dance of mutual respect. I offered advice when asked, guidance when sought, and silence when needed. The most surprising change, however, was within Julia herself. I noticed it in subtle ways: the way she spoke about her clients with empathy rather than just ambition, the way she treated Mark's decisions with consideration rather than unilateral judgment, the way she called me not only with questions, but sometimes just to share a small success, a joke, or a reflection. She had begun to cultivate the independence Daniel had envisioned, but also the humility and accountability she had once lacked. One evening, months after the refinancing, Julia arrived at my doorstep alone, a small bundle in her arms. "I wanted you to see this first," she said, handing me a carefully folded stack of papers. I opened them. They were a journal, a chronicle of her journey through the financial chaos, the mistakes she had made, the lessons she had learned, and the gratitude she felt for the boundaries I had enforced. Tears pricked at my eyes as I read lines like, "Mom taught me that money can't replace wisdom. She gave me the chance to fail, but she didn't leave me to drown. I'm learning to carry responsibility, not entitlement." Julia folded the journal gently and looked up at me. "I wanted you to have it," she said softly. "So one day, when we look back, we remember how far we've come." I pulled her into a hug. She had grown into a woman I could respect fully, not perfect, but accountable, capable, and aware. Years later, the house remained in my name, but the tension that had once choked every corner of it had vanished. Julia and Mark remained steady, their company thriving at a sustainable pace. My nights were filled with music, journaling, and quiet walks in the garden Daniel had loved. The memory of his letter, of his quiet insistence on foresight and self-reliance, became a touchstone, a reminder that the most profound gifts we leave our loved ones are often lessons, not money. One late autumn afternoon, I walked through the yard and noticed the first leaves falling. The maples and oaks swirled in reds and golds. Standing there, I realized something essential. I had finally stopped carrying the weight of what my daughter had done. I had accepted her choices, enforced my boundaries, and created a space where accountability and love could coexist. That, in itself, was freedom. I smiled quietly to myself, imagining Daniel sitting nearby, a small smile on his lips, nodding in approval. The legacy of trust, boundaries, and the courage to teach lessons through love rather than control had been realized. And in that moment, I knew, life could be rebuilt, not by undoing the past, but by learning to navigate it with clarity, courage, and heart.